Hello, this is Hit Pause, a podcast made in San Francisco with more questions than answers. Hello, today we explore the history of media. I want to take you a little bit on a voyage, which is a fascinating one as we paint the picture of today's world of social media and virality. It's a voyage in two parts that we'll take. The first part before our break, going back to the ancient history of our ancestors painting on the caves as a way to transmit information. They gave us beautiful paintings in Lascaux in France and many other prehistorical artifacts. We're going to span from that time to, frankly, the Second World War in an accelerated voyage through time, where you can see that media did not change much with only a couple of technology revolutions. And then in the second part of our podcast today, after the break, we'll accelerate speed tremendously with a lot of changes, changing the fabric of society through an accelerated upheaval of communication technology. So let's go back to the caves where our ancestors are painting with their fingers and dirt, red ochre coming from the stone that they're grinding, bringing the blue of the stones that they're unearthing. I had the chance to recently visit Athens, and the Museum of the Acropolis is an astonishing museum, of course, for all its artifacts. But one of the parts that they have in there is a little rendition under a glass enclosure of the ways and the techniques that the Greeks, and of course all the ancient civilizations, of course, were employing to paint different colors and adorn the statues and the facades of the temples with red and ochre and green and yellows. And it's fascinating to see that the colors at the time were meant to be extremely virulent, extremely with high contrast. The same discovery, by the way, was made years and years later when the Sistine Chapel was refurbished and renovated to its original condition. Everybody had a gasp. We have been used to think or to imagine that the paintings on the Sistine Chapel and many of the historical paintings that we see today in museums may have lost their patina. And the public rediscovered the Sistine Chapel with extremely vivid colors as it was painted at the beginning. So it's fascinating to see that sometimes what we see is not the correct perception of what was. So fast forward to scriptures and writing on stone, the discovery decades, centuries, millennial later by Champollion of the Rosetta Stone, and the transmission of knowledge through writing, which was at the time cuneiform, and writing on tablets, writing on papyrus. Writing was really the main artifact of knowledge transmission, and it took scribes and it took people who had knowledge to be able to write, to be able to read, to be able to transmit. So the knowledge transmission, when you think about it deeply, was mostly verbal and oral for the vast majority of people and written for a very, very small percentage of the population. who was inhabited by the power to read and write. Fast forward to Gutenberg, and with the invention of the Gutenberg press, suddenly the power to write and the power to read becomes democratized. And that's a great technological moment that is probably the first time in our media history that we have an exponential acceleration of the knowledge transmission, because the democratization of the power to print makes it more economically cheaper to reproduce a book, therefore makes the book more affordable, therefore makes the book reading more accessible. And when you look at the history of knowledge transmission and the flourishing of knowledge through the course of the Middle Ages, it is without question that the Gutenberg press reopened the gates of knowledge transmission across Europe. It is fascinating to look at, and for me to think that there is, and the Western world has, a humongous blind spot on the knowledge transmission of the Middle East and the culture of Islam, which was for so many millennium a force of knowledge and diffusion of very advanced ideas, the invention of the zero, and that the fact that there was not enough connection between the Muslim world and the European Catholic world probably was a great disadvantage to humanity at large. Maybe I'll save that for season 2 of the podcast, but I like to digress sometimes. So going back to the Gutenberg press, we arrive in an age of print and an age of books and in an age of newspaper publishing, where the gazettes will be taking the discontentment of the French peasants to a boiling point, and the French Revolution. I'm not linking them directly, but I am linking them indirectly, in the sense that the ability for people to share their passions, their emotions, their anger, their political discontent, the fact that they are hungry, the fact that the king is not helping them, ends up creating a bubble of untold pain, which one day erupts when a economic event ends up piercing the bubble. So newspaper became the culture for many decades after that, and surely all the way to, frankly, the First World War, with, for the largest part, I think that humanity was relying on the print form to get their news. So we are having here a long period of verbal and restricted print transmission that lasted millennia, moving to a period of print transmission that lasted a couple of centuries, which then saw the advent of the radio. And the technology advances of the end of the 19th century, with a shift to the 20th century, saw the advent of the radio telegraph. And suddenly the color of media transmission changes with a medium which is extremely powerful at transmitting emotion, and that is the radio. The radio helps transmit a love song, opera, It's interesting to think even that when Alexander Graham Bell was asked, what do you think the telephone is about? He said it's going to democratize going to the opera, because now people can listen to the sound of the opera singers from their home. It's a typical case of a technologist inventing something and getting wrong the use cases and applications of his or her technology. So back to the radio was frankly the primary means of transmission of the news for the first half of the 20th century. And of course, we all remember I remember as well the movies when I was a kid, watching the story of the Second World War with General de Gaulle speaking from London to the French people through the program, and the famous words, Ici Londres, les Français parlent au français. This was a great moment, and it bonded an entire French resistance through the transmission medium of radio, sometimes with encoded messages to the French resistance. So humanity was able to bend the medium itself to carry messages in encrypted form, talking about les sanglots longs des violons monotones was the moment, the sentence, calling the French resistance, knowing that the American invasion on the beaches of Normandy was about to occur. So encryption, communication, and secure transmission of the message was already there on the airwaves in the radio at the time. The next media revolution and technology that happened was the arrival of TV and the transmission over the same airwaves of a signal which was much more dense in the information it could transmit, which was a full-fledged image, and for that matter, a moving image. And television here intersects the movie making of the 19th century that was carried with a film being then encoded and transmitted and transformed into a wave that could be received by this magical box, the television receiver. So when we think about the 19th century, we actually see two media transitions occurring. One that goes from the newspaper to radio, and which is basically during the course of a lifetime changes how the world and people apprehend news and react to them. And then the passage from radio to TV, with the advent, of course, and the eruption of TV into the political sphere, with, in France, General de Gaulle, who started mastering this, with France glued to their TV sets when he was speaking. And in the United States, the famous debate between Nixon and Kennedy during the campaign, where Kennedy ended up literally coming out of the television screen and charming a lot of Americans with his skills on television or television media. And from that point on, television gave us a broadcast medium where, with frankly 3 to 5 to 10 maybe television channels, with the people changing the channel with a little dial on the TV set, we had a broadcast medium shaping a message that had been curated by a newscaster, the TV anchorman, who was frankly a star in the eyes of the American population or the French population, and the emergence of the early years of TV, where people were following a message or listening to a message that was imparted upon the masses of the audience, with television ratings that could easily reach 20-30% of the audience, i.e. of the television market, with the emergence of very, very large companies, ABC, CBS, NBC, and the age of newscasts, with one of my favorite movies, Good Night and Good Luck, with television journalists who were regarded at the time as the guardians of truth. And now, let's go to a short break to hit pause, reflect, or just continue. Welcome back to our little voyage through time and media and the history of the main technology changes to the business of media. In our first part of this podcast, we covered millennia with very few technology changes to only accelerate in the 20th century, going from newspaper to radio, then from radio to TV. TV itself changed during the last quarter, I should say, of the 19th century and continues to change and morph and merge with new emerging media. Now, when you think about what happened to the business of broadcast television, which was for many decades up until the 80s, the affair of a couple of large companies to a broadcast medium, we saw the arrival of new technologies in the 1980s, and we went from the airwaves to cable. The history of cable television is actually one which is little known by the main population and public, but it is a fascinating one which is grounded into the culture of the United States, as it tells us the story and is steeped in the story of two businessmen, Bob Magnus and John Malone, who probably were as different as they could be, but who built together an empire which is now, whose name is now a little forgotten, Telecommunications Inc., TCI, which was the root, the foundation of what Comcast today is. Bob Magnus was an entrepreneur, and the little story is, you can dive deeper into the online resources that I'll be posting on my website. He was an entrepreneur who, through mostly the chance of life, came across in rural Colorado a friend of his who had a terrestrial antenna in his property, and Bob could not benefit from watching TV because of the location of his house, and location is important in life, and Bob tried to figure out a way to take the signal coming out of that terrestrial antenna on the farm of his friend to draw a long cable to go bring that signal to his own property. And this is how cable television was born, out of necessity and the ingenious mind of Bob Magnus. Few people remember the name Bob Magnus. They remember more the name of his financier partner, John Malone, who transitioned from a career in finances and tax planning and consulting to become the financier that would engineer the financial instruments that would help Bob scale the business of TCI into a collection of cable franchises across the country that later became the bedrock of AT&T Cable, then later on through multiple incarnations, Comcast. And what's important in that story, beyond the story of the two businessmen, is that when cable arrived, we went from a world of 10 television channels to a plethora of television cable channels because of the way that the cable was functioning. It could carry way more information, and therefore the number of television channels started going up. And cable television became, in the United States, a paid medium that would increase the amount of available offerings and channels and tastes, so that consumers who would prefer sports could subscribe to the sports channel. Those who suddenly got intrigued by news could subscribe to cable news networks, CNN, and we started seeing the emergence of new media companies that started filling a void and started breaking the market from audience ratings of 20-30% down to 8-10% when the show was doing well. This is important because that same business transition accelerated when compression technologies came in, and satellite, with the advent of the so-called MPEG-2 technology, which is a very, very profound and powerful video compression algorithm, enabled the number of channels to climb to 1,000. And we therefore had a capitalistic competition between cable and satellite, fueling a number of available channels so that the television audiences could start choosing what they wanted to watch. And that transition from the world of broadcast TV to the world of cable TV to the world of multi-channel television, as it was called at the time, and still is for that matter, exploding the number of television channels by a factor of 100, happened basically within the last 30 years of the 20th century, which is an extremely fast time. So we are looking here at an evolution of the media market with deep competitions between large entrenched players, the advent of new players, the arrival of new TV channels, HBO, ESPN, and many others, that created an offering of media channels so that suddenly the power came back to the consumer, to the audience, to choose what they wanted to choose to watch. And that's important because it meant that you had to choose now from 1,000 channels instead of 3, but it did not mean that you would watch 1,000 channels. When you look at the statistics from Nielsen, the average of the number of TV channels that a typical television household watches in the United States is about 8 to 9. And that number is important. We'll find it in future episodes of the podcast, as it is about the same number of friends that we interact often on social media. So consumers gravitated towards 8 or 9 channels, but what's important here is that the 8 or 9 channels that you watch are very different than the 8 or 9 channels that I watch, and the 8 or 9 channels that your mom, your aunt, your father, your kids actually watch. And that evolution shaped the way that consumers end up ingesting, taking, accepting in their life, in their brains and in their heart, the news of the world. It gave and it gives us a chance to turn off a channel, a chance to rate it with a thumbs up or a thumbs down. That was an invention by TiVo that gave us that power. And additional technology advances that are secondary and corollary to this explosion of channels. TiVo gave us the power to pause broadcast TV and to decide when we would watch the TV. Sling Media and Orb Networks, where I used to work, we gave the technology world the power to change where you wanted to watch your TV outside of the home. That was very novel at the time, carrying a TV signal over a wireless or line or computer internet line. And therefore, in that world, consumers started gravitating towards the channels they liked. This is where we're going to pause for today. Having traversed tens of thousands of years of communication and medium technologies, to go from a world where only the few could transmit information and read it and write it, to everybody choosing and selecting and handpicking the television content that they want. This podcast is a simple way of sharing my thoughts. It is a personal endeavor, nothing more, a way to connect. The views and opinions represented in this podcast are solely mine. There are in no way, nor should they be assumed to be shared, supported, endorsed by my employer, the sponsors of this show, Anchor.fm, where it is hosted, and all the distributors thereof. You may find more information, links, pictures, videos, documents, and more, which may have been referenced in this podcast, on my website at www.uteza.com/podcast. There, it feels so much better after saying all of this. And so, it's time to part ways, at least for now. Until next time, time to say goodnight, time to hit pause.